I was 14 when my brother left me at a rest stop off I-70, the middle of Kansas. Not because he forgot, not because something went wrong, because I got the scholarship and he didn't. He said he needed to use the bathroom. He said, "Stay here. Don't wander." He handed me the last of his gas station Cheetos like it was some kind of peace offering. I sat on the curb next to a broken vending machine and watched his gray Honda disappear into the flat, nothing of the highway. I kept waiting for him to come back. I kept thinking the car would reappear over that long, straight line where the road met the sky. It never did. I was 14 years old, sitting on a curb in Wilson, Kansas, with $6 in my pocket and a half-eaten bag of chips. And somewhere on that highway, my brother was driving home without me. His name is Daniel. He is 4 years older than me. And for most of my life, I thought he was the best person I knew. I need you to understand that before everything else, because none of what comes after makes sense, unless you understand how much I loved him. Daniel was the kind of brother who taught me to ride a bike in the Walmart parking lot on Sundays, who let me pick the movie every Friday night without complaint, who showed up to every single one of my middle school volleyball games even when I barely played. He was the one who stayed up with me the night before my first big math test, drilling me on fractions until I finally stopped crying. He was patient and funny and warm, and I would have done anything for him. That's the part that makes the rest so hard to say out loud. The summer I was 14, both Daniel and I had applied for the Hargrove Academic Scholarship, a full-ride program offered through our county for students pursuing STEM. My mother had pushed us both to apply. Money was always the conversation in our house. My father left when I was 8. And after that it was just the three of us in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dayton, Ohio, with my mother working double shifts at the hospital and a stack of bills she kept in a kitchen drawer she never fully closed. Daniel was 18. I was 14. He was applying for college funding. I was applying for a specialized high school program downstate that came with a full academic scholarship through graduation. We both applied. We both interviewed. We both waited. I got it. He didn't. I remember the day the letters came. I remember my mother crying in the kitchen, the good kind of crying, the hand-over-mouth kind, and Daniel standing in the doorway to the hall, reading his own letter, his face completely still. I remember saying his name and he looked at me and smiled and said, "That's amazing. Maya. Seriously." He hugged me. He meant it. Or I thought he did. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, my mother arranged for Daniel to drive me downstate to tour the program campus before the fall semester. It was a 6-hour round trip. My mother had to work. She trusted him completely. We stopped at a rest stop about 2 hours into the drive. I remember Daniel seemed quiet that morning, but I thought it was just the early hour. He'd barely spoken since we left Dayton. I thought he was tired. I was not paying attention to the right things. When his car didn't come back, I waited 40 minutes before I let myself accept what was happening. I went inside the rest stop and asked a woman at the information desk if I could use the phone. She looked at me for a long moment. I must have looked exactly as young as I was, and she handed it over without a word. I called my mother's cell phone. No answer. She was in a shift. I called our home number. Rang and rang. I called Daniel's cell. He picked up on the second ring. "Where are you?" I said. There was a pause. Then on my way home, I didn't say anything for a second. I genuinely could not process it. "You left me." I said. "You'll figure it out." He said. "You're the smart one." Right. And then he hung up. I stood in that rest stop in Wilson, Kansas, and I want to be precise here, because I've thought about this moment 10,000 times and I felt something shift inside me that I don't think ever fully shifted back. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even anger. Not yet. It was clarity. Cold. Clean. Horrible clarity. He had planned this. The information desk woman, whose name I later learned was Carol. Called the local sheriff's office. A deputy came, took my information, contacted my mother's hospital. By the time my mother reached me by phone, she was crying, a different kind of cry, ragged and low and awful. She had to borrow money from a coworker to wire me bus fare. I rode a Greyhound bus alone from Kansas back to Ohio. It took 11 hours. I was 14 years old. When I got home, Daniel had already told his version of the story. He said I'd wandered off. He said he'd looked for me and panicked and assumed I'd found a way back. He said he'd tried to call, but his phone was dying. My mother looked at me across the kitchen table and asked me if that was true. I looked at her for a long time. I thought about the two of us. All those years in that apartment. I thought about the drawer that never closed all the way. I thought about how tired she looked. And I made a decision. Yes, I said. I wandered off. I protected him. I still don't fully understand why. Maybe I thought it would break her if she knew the truth. Maybe I was ashamed that I hadn't seen it coming. Maybe some part of me still didn't believe a person who taught me to ride a bike could do something like that on purpose. I started the scholarship program that fall. I threw myself into it completely, not because I was trying to prove something. Not yet. But because it was the only place that felt clean. The other students were sharp and driven and strange in the same ways I was strange. The classes were hard in a way that required my full attention, which was exactly what I needed. I stopped going home on weekends after the first month. I told my mother I was busy. She believed me. Or she accepted it. My relationship with Daniel became a hallway nod at holidays. We never spoke about Kansas. He acted like it hadn't happened, and so did I. And after a while, the silence became its own kind of story that we both agreed to tell. I graduated at the top of my program, full scholarship to Ohio State for mechanical engineering. I moved into the dorms with 2 suitcases and a very specific plan. I was going to build a life so solid that nothing could shake it. Not grief. Not family. Not the memory of a rest stop in Kansas. My name at the scholarship program had been Maya Reeves, my mother's maiden name, which I'd technically always had as a middle name. When I enrolled at Ohio State, I filed paperwork to formally go by Maya Reeves rather than Maya Briggs. It wasn't a legal name change yet. Just a preference. But it felt important. Like drawing a line. At 22, after graduation, I made it legal. Maya Reeves. I started a junior engineering position at a firm in Columbus. I had an apartment that was mine. A salary that was mine. A life that felt for the first time in a long time entirely mine. I did not tell my mother about the name change. I told myself it was to avoid a conversation I didn't have the energy for. That was partially true. The other part was that I was not ready to explain why. She found out anyway. Eventually, we had a hard phone call. She cried. She asked me why. I told her I needed a fresh start and I loved her and that the name was just a name. She didn't understand, but she let it go. The way she let most things go. We stayed in contact birthdays, holidays, occasional calls. It was careful and quiet, and it was enough. Daniel. I heard about secondhand. He'd taken a few community college courses, dropped them, worked a series of jobs that didn't stick. He was living back in Dayton. My mother mentioned him in passing sometimes. The way you mention weather as fact. Without editorial. I did not ask follow-up questions. I was 26 when I made senior engineer. 28 when I led my first full project, a structural redesign for a regional infrastructure contract that came in under budget and ahead of schedule. I was good at my job in the way that only people who made work their entire personality for 6 years can be. I did not have many close friends. I had colleagues I respected and a therapist I saw on Thursdays and a routine that worked. I had not spoken to Daniel in 9 years. Then, on a Tuesday in March, a letter arrived at my apartment. Not an email. A letter. Handwritten envelope. Date and postmark. My legal name written on the front in handwriting. I recognized immediately and viscerally. In the same handwriting that used to sign birthday cards for me every year until it didn't anymore. I stood in my hallway for a long time holding it. I put it on my kitchen counter. I made coffee. I stood at the window and looked at the Columbus skyline for probably 10 minutes. Then I opened it. It was 4 pages. Handwritten. I'm not going to tell you everything it said. Some of it is not mine to share, and some of it I'm still processing. But the core of it was this: Daniel had been in therapy for 2 years. His therapist had encouraged him to reach out to people he had harmed. He was writing to acknowledge what he did in Kansas. He said he had known exactly what he was doing. He said the scholarship had broken something in him that he hadn't understood at the time and couldn't excuse now. He said he was sorry. He said if I never responded, he would understand. He also said, and this was the line I read 4 times, that he had found my address through a private investigator he'd hired 8 months earlier. He'd known how to find me for 8 months, and had spent that time working up the courage to write. I set the letter down. I called my therapist and asked if she had any cancellations that week. I want to be honest with you about what I felt. Because I think people expect a certain kind of story here, and I'm not sure this is that story. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. Mostly. And sad. The specific sadness of realizing that the version of your brother you grieved was real. That he existed. That the person who taught you to ride a bike and stayed up for fractions really was in there, and he was also the person who drove away and left you with $6 and a bag of chips on the side of I-70. Both of those things were true at the same time. I'd spent years pretending only one of them was. I didn't respond to the letter for 6 weeks. My therapist did not tell me what to do. She was very careful about that. What she said was, what would responding get you? And what would not responding cost you? I thought about that for a long time. What I kept coming back to was not Daniel at all. It was my mother. It was the fact that she had spent 10 years with a version of events that wasn't true. She had never known what her son did. She had never been given the chance to know. She'd spent a decade in the middle of a rift she didn't understand, trying to be careful with both of us. And she'd done it without any of the information she needed. That felt wrong to me in a way that Daniel's letter didn't fix. I called my mother first. That conversation lasted 2 hours, and I'm not going to describe it in detail because it belongs to her more than it belongs to me. I will say that she was not entirely surprised. She told me that for years she'd had a feeling about Kansas that she'd never allowed herself to follow. She told me she was sorry she hadn't pushed harder. She cried. I cried. By the end of it, we were both quiet in the way you are after something has finally been said that needed to be said for a very long time. She said, "What are you going to do about your brother?" I said. "I don't know yet." I wrote Daniel back 3 weeks later. I told him I'd received his letter. I told him I had appreciated that he was honest about the private investigator, that if he'd pretended he found me some other way, I would have known immediately and the letter would have meant nothing. I told him I believed his apology was genuine. And then I told him something that I meant completely. I told him that I forgave him. And I told him that forgiveness did not mean I wanted him in my life. I told him I was not angry anymore. That the anger had burned out somewhere around year 4, and what was left was not hate but was something more like distance, a permanent and necessary distance. I told him I hoped his therapy was helping. I told him I hoped he built something good. I told him I did not want to meet for coffee or a phone call or any version of a reunion. I wished him well, and I meant it. I mailed that letter on a Friday morning. I walked to the post office on my lunch break, fed it into the outgoing slot, and then I stood outside on the sidewalk in the March cold, and I felt lighter is not quite the right word. Lighter implies weight removed. What I felt was more like completion. Like a file that had been open in the background of my operating system for 9 years had finally, quietly, closed. I walked back to my office. I had a 2:00 meeting. I went to it. I've thought a lot about what revenge means. And I'll tell you what I've landed on. Revenge is not a confrontation. It's not a speech. It's not watching someone suffer for what they did to you. Real revenge, the kind that actually works, is building something so whole and so yours that their absence in it feels like nothing at all. My brother left me in Kansas because he thought the scholarship was mine instead of his. Because he thought I had taken something from him. What he could not have predicted, what I couldn't have predicted either. Sitting on that curb at 14 was what I would build with it. I have a life. I have a career I earned, and a name I chose, and an apartment in a city where I made myself from scratch. I have a mother I talk to on Sunday evenings. I have a therapist I trust and colleagues I respect, and very occasionally a Friday night where I order takeout and watch whatever I want without asking anyone's permission. My brother drove away from a rest stop in Kansas and handed me, without meaning to, the exact circumstances that made me who I am. Ifageo him. I don't need him. Both of those things are true at the same time. And that is the story I carry.